Hello, I am Jae-hee Lee, the head instructor of Lee's Science Academy. In the last class, we studied how knowledge is created based on the abstraction ability and logical thinking possessed by the human cognitive system. Today, we will begin the video titled Laws of Logic and Methods of Proof. Let me explain the composition of today's video. Today we will look at the rules of logic, or laws of logic that we can rely on to think accurately and logically, giving you the confidence that your thinking is logical. The logical rules we will examine are the Law of Identity, Law of Contradiction, and Law of Excluded Middle. We will also learn about the methods of proving propositions, which are the ways to obtain knowledge by proving a proposition is true based on logical laws. We will explore induction and deduction. Let's learn about the laws of logic that we can rely on to ensure our thinking is logical. Thinking means continuing one's thoughts, and what connects those thoughts is language, or the concepts expressed by language. Therefore, thinking is mediating concepts expressed by language to continue one's thoughts. Therefore, in the thinking process of proving the truth of a proposition, it is very important to connect thoughts correctly without making mistakes. If logic collapses or there is a leap in logic during the thinking process, no matter how hard you think, the resulting thought will be wrong. So, to prevent our thinking from going astray, we will study 3 laws of logic as a standard to guide us to connect our thoughts correctly. The 3 laws are the Law of Identity, Law of Contradiction, and Law of Excluded Middle. Let's learn about the Law of Identity, which states that identical things are identical. It is the law that when thinking about an object, it is correct to judge it as identical to itself and correct to judge it as different from other things. Does this sound too obvious? However, it is the law that dictates an apple must be called an apple to be correct, and calling an apple a banana or a strawberry is incorrect. If you meet someone who insists black is white or blue is red, you can point out that they are wrong because they are violating the law of identity. The simplest propositions applying the law of identity are tautologies of language or explanations of specific concepts. A tautology is thinking, an apple is an apple, which is correct thinking. A concept explanation like, such a thing, for example, the red one is an apple, is a correct expression, while such a thing, the yellow one is a strawberry, is incorrect. Also, judging the student's name is so-and-so is correct thinking if so-and-so is their actual name. The law of identity applies not only to identical things, but also to inclusion relationships. For example, the expression, a human is an animal, is judged to be correct because animals include humans. On the other hand, an animal is a human is judged to be incorrect. This is because, among animals, there are things that are not human, such as fish or puppies. An example that proves a proposition is false like this is called a counterexample. The proposition, an animal is a human, has a counterexample, making it a false proposition. In demonstrative geometry, which we will study later, defining 2 given triangles as congruent, if translating one perfectly overlaps the other, is also an application of the law of identity. Additionally, the zeroth law of thermodynamics, which judges that the temperatures of 2 objects are the same if the temperatures of an apple and a liquid measured by a thermometer are identical, is an application of the law of identity. For your reference in advance, the law of identity, a logical law, must be distinguished from the method of identity, an indirect proof method we will study later. Secondly, let's learn about the law of contradiction and the law of excluded middle together. The dictionary definition of the law of contradiction can be slightly ambiguous, so please understand it clearly here. The law of contradiction is related to contradictory relationships and the law of excluded middle, so they must be understood in connection with each other. The law of contradiction states that one must not develop logic based on a contradictory relationship, and one must not judge claims in a contradictory relationship as correct. Therefore, to think logically while abiding by the law of contradiction, one must first know what a contradictory relationship is. A contradictory relationship refers to the relationship between two objects when two systems or propositions cannot both be true at the same time or cannot both be false at the same time. The simplest and most useful contradictory relationship is the relationship between affirmation and negation. This is tilde and this is not tilde represent a clear contradictory relationship. If is true, is not cannot be true, and if is false, is not cannot be false. Therefore, they are in a contradictory relationship where they cannot be simultaneously true or simultaneously false. Do you understand? Let me give a concrete example. Here, an apple and a mango are given. If a person points to the apple and says, "This is an apple," while another person points to the apple and says, "This is not an apple," one of them must be wrong, so they cannot both be correct or both be wrong at the same time. In other words, the two people's statements are in a contradictory relationship. By the same logic, pointing to the mango and saying it is not an apple and saying it is an apple are also in a contradictory relationship. Thus, because they cannot be simultaneously true or simultaneously false, understand that the two claims are in a contradictory relationship. The meaning of the law of contradiction is that one must not make two claims that are in a contradictory relationship, and one must not judge claims in a contradictory relationship to be correct. But what if a third case, an apple-mango created by breeding, is given? Both claims could be wrong, or both could be correct. Focusing on the apple part, "it is an apple," is correct. And focusing on the mango part, "it is not an apple," is correct, making both propositions true at the same time. Also, focusing on the mango part, "it is an apple," is incorrect. And focusing on the apple part, "it is not an apple," is also incorrect, making both propositions false at the same time. Cases where they become simultaneously true or simultaneously false create an extremely confusing situation in logical thinking. To avoid such situations, the law of excluded middle is established as a logical law. The way to prevent the confusion caused by the apple-mango is very simple, setting the law of excluded middle as a logical law. The law of excluded middle means rejecting the middle. It predetermines that from the beginning there are no cases like half apple and half mango. Like this, it is a logical law dictating that one must think as if there is no third case, such as the apple-mango, besides an apple or a mango, or besides this or that. In other words, the law of excluded middle demands that the content constituting a system must be clearly divided into two distinct parts, without any ambiguous parts. It is a logical law stating that one must not allow a third case other than the two parts. Please note the use of the passive voice must be made to exist or must be made not to exist here. For example, if a given system consists of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can think of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as substituting for individual entities, not just numbers. If you make one part with 1, 2, you must make the rest 3, 4, 5, 6, ensuring there is no third case. Then you must think that if 1, 2 is, then 3, 4, 5, 6 is the case of is not, and if 1, 2 is not, then 3, 4, 5, 6 becomes is. Any third case other than these does not exist because it was not allowed from the beginning. Even if it consists of 3 parts, 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 5, 6, you must think such that if you group 1, 2, 3, 4, the rest is 5, 6, and if you separate 3, 4, the rest is 1, 2, 5, 6, ensuring only the states of is and is not exist. These laws of contradiction and excluded middle form the logical structure of proof by contradiction in mathematics, so we will look at them again when we study proof by contradiction. Please understand well here that the law of excluded middle does not allow for a third case. However, the law of excluded middle requires configuring or dividing into only 2 cases, is and is not. But not all objects or systems we handle are subject to the law of excluded middle. Therefore, when we judge the truth or falsehood of a proposition, we must first discern whether the given system or object is subject to the law of excluded middle. Generally, while the black and white logic where the law of excluded middle applies is applicable to most objects in natural science, it is usually not the case for social phenomena, so one must be careful. For example, there are cases that are neither good nor evil, and some cases show both good and evil aspects, being both good and evil. Also, besides being infected with germs and getting sick, or not being infected and being healthy, there is a third case of being infected but remaining in a healthy carrier state. Let's better understand the content of the law of excluded middle through cases in mathematics where it does not apply. When we divide real numbers into 3 parts, positive numbers, negative numbers, and 0, the law of excluded middle does not apply. When the given number is 0, the proposition is not a negative number does not mean is a positive number, so the propositions is a negative number and is a positive number are both false, and is not a negative number and is not a positive number can both be true. The negation of the proposition is not a positive number includes 0 as a third case besides negative numbers, so you must consider the cases carefully. From now on, we will learn about proof methods to prove a given proposition is true based on logical laws. First is induction. In the last lecture, we said that the proposition "the sun rises in the east" is confirmed to be true by experience. Like this, the proof method that guarantees the truth of a proposition based on experience is called induction. And Lee Science Academy classifies knowledge obtained by induction as inductive knowledge or sensory knowledge. Another method guaranteeing the truth of a proposition, different from induction, is deduction. Deduction is a method of creating or finding new true propositions through logical thinking. At this time, logical thinking is based on known knowledge and takes place according to the laws of logic studied earlier. Therefore, just as life creates new life, deduction can create new knowledge from existing knowledge. And Lee's Science Academy classifies knowledge obtained by deduction as deductive knowledge or logical knowledge. Let's look at induction more specifically. Induction is a proof method that judges something to be correct in all cases based on experience. Based on experience so far, since there have been no wrong cases contradicting the proposition, it expands the interpretation to assume it will be correct in all future cases as well, and as a result, judges the given proposition to be true. It generalizes limited experiences to apply to all cases. This judgment assumes that no wrong cases will occur in the future either. But will such cases really not happen in the future? No one can guarantee the future. Induction has uncertainty about future phenomena. Inductive knowledge must be constantly verified based on future experiences due to its inherent uncertainty. Depending on the results of verification, a proposition that was once true can be turned into a false one or modified at any time. Let's examine the verification methods for inductive knowledge. There are two methods for verifying inductive knowledge: experience or experiment, and discernment through logical thinking. Let's look at verification through experience or experiment. We can obtain facts or experiences that do not match the proposition through experience or experiment. A fact or experience that does not match the proposition is called a counterexample to that proposition. Induction has the limitation of becoming false knowledge if a counterexample appears in the future. Inductive knowledge remains true knowledge until a counterexample appears. If a counterexample appears in experience or experiment, the proposition becomes false. If a counterexample is found or appears, the corresponding proposition must be discarded or modified as a false proposition. Let me explain the verification of inductive knowledge using the proposition given earlier as an example. The sun rises in the east. If a person who strictly applies the meaning of east says no, in my experience, in winter the sun rises leaning towards the south, not the east, and in summer it rises leaning towards the north, then the proposition must be modified to the sun rises from the eastern direction rather than in the east. Also, if someone claims the sun rises from the eastern direction, soars high towards the south, and sets in the western direction, and everyone accepts it as correct, it is modified as such. If someone says no, when I went to Australia, it is true that the sun rises from the eastern direction, but instead of soaring towards the south, it soars high towards the north and sets in the western direction. The proposition must be modified through this verification. The new proposition must be modified to, in the northern hemisphere the sun rises from the eastern direction, soars high towards the south, and sets in the western direction. In the southern hemisphere, it soars high towards the north. Let's look at the second verification method: logical thinking and discernment. Today, even if we say, in the northern hemisphere the sun rises from the eastern direction, soars high towards the south, and sets in the western direction, we do not think the sun moves with the earth at the center. We well understand that, quote, what moves is not the sun but the earth. However, due to the earth's rotation and the relativity of motion, the sun merely appears to move relative to the earth. Many propositions undergo logical verification to confirm their content is true. Applying logical thinking and discernment to the verification of inductive knowledge is the application of deduction, which we will look at later. Let's learn about laws that frequently appear in natural science. In physics or natural science, propositions inductively accepted as correct regarding repeated experiments or natural phenomena are usually called laws and are not proven separately. Important laws like the following are verified by experiments or phenomena and are not proven: Kepler's laws, Newton's laws of motion, the law of conservation of energy, the law of conservation of momentum, Faraday's law, the second law of thermodynamics, Boyle-Charles's law, the law of conservation of charge, Mendel's laws of inheritance. We will deal with the contents of each law in detail in the science lectures. Since these laws also have the limitations of induction, they go through a process of continuous verification through experiments or experience of new facts. This is why experiments are important in natural science. Historically, through verification, very important propositions or laws have been discarded or modified. Let's look more into deduction as the second proof method. We defined deduction as a method of creating or finding new true propositions by logically thinking according to logical laws based on already known knowledge. Deduction is a method of finding new true knowledge, proposition Q, based on knowledge that is a true proposition, proposition P. Basically, it has a deductive structure. If this proposition P is correct, that proposition Q is correct. The deductive structure takes the form of a conditional proposition. This structure is simply expressed as if P, then Q, or P implies Q. More precisely, it takes the conditional proposition form, if P is true, then Q is also true. If this conditional proposition is proven true, we accept proposition Q as knowledge. As a result, we gain new knowledge. What you must keep in mind here is that you must apply logical laws and logical thinking to the inference process of the conditional proposition. In a conditional proposition, such and such true proposition P is called the hypothesis or premise, and such true proposition Q is called the conclusion. Therefore, deduction is a proof method where, if the conditional proposition is true, the truth of the hypothesis proposition guarantees the truth of the conclusion proposition. We will study this in detail later in the math proposition section, but here we will just define the converse, inverse, and contrapositive as propositions related to conditional propositions. When dividing the content of a proposition into is and is not, by applying the law of excluded middle, the symbol for a negative proposition is set as a tilde and read as not. Therefore, not P is the negation of is P, meaning is not P. A conditional proposition takes the form if P, then Q. At this time, the proposition made by swapping the hypothesis and conclusion of the proposition, if Q, then P, is called the converse or converse proposition of the given conditional proposition. Also, if the direction of inference is the same but you take the negative propositions of the conditional proposition, it becomes, if not P, then not Q. This is called the inverse or inverse proposition of the conditional proposition. And if you negate both P and Q of the given proposition and then make the converse, it becomes, if not Q, then not P. The converse proposition that negates the conclusion and hypothesis like this is called the contrapositive or contrapositive proposition of the conditional proposition. What is good to know in advance here is that the given proposition and the contrapositive proposition are identical, called logically equivalent, so when the given proposition is true, the contrapositive proposition is also true. Also, even if the given proposition is true, the converse proposition is not necessarily true. Here, let's practice deduction using the syllogism, which is familiar to us. Syllogism is a representative deductive method for obtaining new knowledge solely through logical thinking based on already known knowledge. Here is an example of a syllogism. All humans are mortal. True proposition P. Socrates is a human. True proposition Q. Therefore Socrates is mortal. New true proposition R. This logic has the structure: if P and Q, then R. Based on the two true propositions P and Q mentioned earlier, we learned the new fact that Socrates is mortal. Let's examine the structure of the syllogism to see what kind of thinking process leads to learning a new fact. A person A said to Socrates, "Master, you will die." Socrates protests, "What are you talking about? I will not die." Then A spoke quietly, "The proposition that you will die is true. I will prove it from now on. First, do you accept that the proposition, all humans are mortal, is true?" Socrates said, "Since I have seen all people around me die, I accept it according to induction." Then A asked again, "Master, you are a human, right?" Socrates thought for a moment and replied, "Yes. Since the concept of a human, created by abstraction, matches me, I accept it as true that I am a human according to the law of identity." Then A said, "Master Socrates, therefore, the proposition that you will die also becomes true." Socrates stood completely still, lost in deep thought. Do you understand the conclusion of the syllogism? Here, let's examine deductive relationships and causality, which are very important in natural science. In natural science dealing with causality, deduction reflects causality. In natural science, the logical relationship of cause and effect, where, because of this and this, it is that and that, constitutes the deductive relationship of if P, then Q. Taking an example from physics, let's consider the conditional proposition: if you kick a standing stone, the stone moves. How can we know if this phenomenon is a true proposition that actually happens? Since this proposition contains a condition, it becomes a conditional proposition, and the hypothesis proposition is the act of kicking, which becomes true if actually kicked. And the conclusion proposition is the phenomenon of moving. Since the hypothesis becomes true if actually kicked, the truth of the hypothesis is guaranteed. Then let's see how the truth of the conclusion is guaranteed. Here we know that Newton's law of acceleration, namely the proposition, quote, if a force is applied to an object with mass, its velocity changes, quote, is true. This law of acceleration is logically applied to the inference thinking process, if P, then Q. In this case, the stone is a mass object, and kicking is identical to applying force. Therefore, according to the law of acceleration, since the stone received force, its velocity must change, and changing velocity is identical to moving, so the stone will move. In conclusion, the given proposition, if you kick a standing stone, the stone moves, is proven as a true proposition. From now on, we will express the thinking process of obtaining new knowledge deductively as inferring or inference. So far, we have studied the 3 laws of logic and 2 methods of proving propositions. In fact, what we call knowing means acquiring knowledge. And acquiring knowledge means proving that the content expressed in the form of a proposition is true by induction or deduction. From now on, all the knowledge you study is expressed in the form of propositions, so please try to prove they are true by yourself. Through this process, we will be able to systematically understand natural and biological phenomena and have an independent perspective. In the next class, we will take time to examine the content of knowledge. And we will logically analyze whether absolute truth exists or not. It's an interesting topic. I will end today's lecture here. Thank you.